Hello everyone, this is the lesson read aloud recording for the 2.01 lesson Growing Tension. Unit Introduction Formation of the United States. Most American colonists in 1763 were proud to be citizens of the world's most powerful empire. Britain boasted not only vast territories but the finest military and broadest civil liberties of any nation on earth. Just 25 years later, citizens of the United States, many of them with clear memories of 1763, had broken away from Britain, fought a long and difficult war to secure their independence, experimented with the loose confederation of states, and written a new plan of government for their young republic. The quarter century between 1763 and 1789 changed the face and history of the world. Okay, lesson introduction. Colonists joyfully celebrated the British victory in the French and Indian War. The colonists were proud of their English heritage and rejoiced in being associated with the powerful British Empire. The victory meant the British had doubled their territory in North America. The colonists eagerly anticipated settling the flat, fertile lands that Britain had won west of the Appalachian Mountains. But the jubilant mood quickly soured. In just over a decade, the colonists denounced the king and Parliament as tyrannical. They protested, boycotted British products, refused to pay taxes, and even took up arms against the British soldiers. What happened? Okay, so we're going to find out what did happen in today's lesson. We're going to recognize major territorial and political results of the French and Indian War, explain the disagreement between the British government and the colonists on the issues of taxation and parliamentary authority after 1763, explain the disagreement and growing tension between the British government and the colonists on issues of taxation and parliamentary authority between 1763 and 1775, and trace the growing tension between Britain and the colonies before 1774. Okay, now let's see. Oh, don't forget to get your reading guide and lesson answer key. And starting with page 112, and that's just the beginning of the chapter where we have the timeline of events, the things that we're going to be looking at and covering, and some of the most notable events of that period, and starting with the road to revolution. In 1763, British subjects on both sides of the Atlantic celebrated victory over France. Benjamin Franklin cheered the glorious peace that ended the war and dramatically expanded Britain's territory in North America. Americans thrilled to the prospect of new land in the West. Franklin spoke for most colonists when he declared that the glory of Britain was never higher and that the country never had a better prince than young King George III. In London, William Pitt, the Minister of War, responded affectionately, "I love the Americans because they love liberty, and I love them for the noble efforts they made in the war." But this mutual admiration did not last. In little more than a decade, Benjamin Franklin would call King George a tyrant, and the British Parliament would send armed troops to put down rebellion in the colonies. What happened? Why did Franklin and thousands of other colonists, who once took such great pride in their status as British subjects, turn against their king and take up arms for independence? What turned once loyal British subjects into independent American citizens? 13 not-so-unified colonies. From the start, the English colonists in North America had been a determined and independent lot. Consider that many of the original colonists had suffered persecution at home for their maverick ideas. Rather than give up their deeply held religious beliefs or political convictions, they struck out on perilous voyages to an unknown land. Once in America, the colonists and their descendants set up various kinds of colonies, from Puritan commonwealths to plantation aristocracies. They often quarreled among themselves over boundaries, trade, and resources. In general, the colonies ignored each other, even in times of crisis. When Indians attacked New York, the neighboring colony of Massachusetts refused to send aid. Later, when Massachusetts was under attack, the New York Assembly returned the favor by ignoring calls for help from Massachusetts. Leaders of different colonies showed little interest in meeting one another to discuss their common problems. In 1754, when the Board of Trade summoned colonial representatives to a conference about the new French threat on the western frontier, only 7 colonies sent delegates. The colonists did manage to come together to fight their common enemies in the French and Indian War. New Yorkers, Pennsylvanians, and Georgians shared pride in the heroic exploits of colonial officers such as Virginia's young George Washington, who hoped to become an officer in the British Army. They also shared a grudge that colonial troops and officers were not paid as much as the British regulars. But after the war ended, most colonists focused on their own futures and returned to their old habits of generally ignoring colonies other than their own. Sometimes the disregard turned hostile, even among people who lived in the same colony. In 1771, a civil war broke out in North Carolina when the poor western farmers revolted against taxes. against taxes imposed by wealthy Eastern planters. Massachusetts lawyer James Otis predicted, were these colonies left to themselves tomorrow, America would be a mere shambles of blood and confusion. Proud to be British. While the colonists were far from unified, recent movements had encouraged some shared ideas and attitudes. During the Great Awakening, revivalist ministers encouraged colonists, who were mostly British Protestants, to look beyond their denominational rivalries. Especially among the educated, the intellectual movement known as the Enlightenment fostered shared ways of thinking about society and politics, with colonial thinkers embracing the new emphasis on reason, natural law, and natural rights. Most of all, however, the majority of colonists were bound by a shared pride in being English. They were proud of Britain as both a rising world power and the historic home of liberty, birthplace of the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights. In the mid-1700s, British subjects enjoyed more rights and freedoms than any other nation. And though it had not happened by design, in the North America colonies, Englishmen enjoyed even greater freedom and political participation than their brethren across the Atlantic. Over the course of a century, colonial assemblies elected by the colonists themselves made most of the laws for the colonies. Because many colonists owned property, a requirement to vote, a large percentage of them could vote for town and colonial officials. Unlike the British Parliament in London, colonial assemblies were often close at hand, making it easier for colonists to voice concerns to lawmakers. These colonial assemblies, which set taxes to be paid by colonists, governed the colonies with relatively little interference from the British government. So while Englishmen in Britain celebrated the rights of the Englishmen, Britain celebrated the rights of the English. So while Englishmen in Britain celebrated the rights of Englishmen, Englishmen in America lived those rights in an unprecedented way. In 1763, full of patriotic fervor for England and affection for King George III, most colonists stood ready to embrace the future as proud Britons and part of the growing glory of the British Empire. They would soon discover, however, that they had more in common with each other than with their cousins across the ocean. Proclamation of 1763. As a result of victory in the French and Indian War, Britain won huge territorial gains in North America. But the costly war drove the American treasury deep into debt. Moreover, Britain faced enormous expenses in running a global empire that now stretched from North America to India. Britain's expanded North American territory delighted the colonists, who were eager to press west over the Appalachians as far as the Mississippi River. But that expansion presented Britain with new challenges and additional costs to defend against Indian attacks. This land was home to many Native Americans who had been allies and trading partners with the French. The Indians looked on the British as enemies, especially as British settlers pushed west into Indian hunting grounds. An Ottawa leader named Pontiac organized a broad alliance of Native American peoples from the Great Lakes in the Ohio and Mississippi valleys. His goal was nothing less than to drive out the British. Pontiac's War, as it's sometimes called Pontiac's Rebellion, wiped out frontier settlements and many of the major British forts from Pennsylvania to Virginia. Pontiac himself led the siege of the British fort at Detroit. British soldiers finally forced most of the Indian leaders to agree to a peace treaty, but only after the British had suffered significant losses. Even before the end of Pontiac's War, British leaders decided on two courses of action. First, to provide defense, they would station 10,000 troops in North America. Second, to make the task of defense simpler and less costly, the British issued the Proclamation of 1763, which decreed that the colonists must stay on the eastern side of the Appalachian Mountains, away from Indians on the western side. In effect, Britain drew an imaginary line north-south along the crest of the Appalachians and forbade colonists to cross it. The proclamation outraged the growing population of colonists, particularly farmers living in the back country foothills closest to the mountains. With limited flat land to farm and more families moving in to farm it, they had been dreaming about the rich, fertile soil that laid behind the mountains. Many ignored the British proclamation, hitched up their wagons, and defiantly crossed Britain's imaginary line as they headed west into Indian country. While small farmers, hunters, and trappers ignored the proclamation of 1763, another group, including some of the most prominent men in North America, found they could not evade it. These men were land speculators, wealthy investors who had bought vast tracts of land west of the mountains. They had hoped to profit from their investments, but the proclamation effectively rendered their land claims worthless. Since many Americans had fought alongside the British precisely to secure these frontier lands, they were indignant to be refused the right to settle in what they regarded as vacant British land. No taxation without representation. The American colonists deeply resented the proclamation of 1763, but resent turned to fury when Britain began taxing the colonists. The colonists were used to paying taxes to their own colonies, but not to Britain. For many decades, Britain had mostly looked the other way while letting the colonists run their own affairs. True, Britain had occasionally tried to exercise control over the colonies, most notably when Parliament had passed a series of navigation acts beginning in the 1650s. These laws required the colonies to sell all their tobacco, furs, and other raw materials to England, and to buy all manufactured products from their mother country. Colonists who wished to trade with other countries such as Holland or France had to pay a duty. But these tariffs didn't bother colonists much, because England was the most advanced industrial country and the best market for colonial products in the world. And besides, the British had never strictly enforced the acts. In 1764, a new law angered and alarmed the colonists even though it lowered taxes. Why then did it upset them so? In part because it required them to obey an old law they had been ignoring for decades. The law the colonists had long ignored, the Molasses Act of 1733, placed a duty on molasses imported from countries outside the British Empire. This law was designed to protect the interests of sugarcane planters in the British West Indies who made molasses. But British planters could not produce enough molasses to meet the needs of New England distillers who ran a thriving business producing rum, a sweet liquor made from fermented molasses. So New Englanders bought some of their molasses from French colonies in the Caribbean and avoided the import duty by paying bribes to customs officials in port cities such as Boston and New York. For almost 30 years, the colonists flagrantly violated the Molasses Act, smuggling French molasses to New England distillers. Then their actions came to the attention of Britain's stern Prime Minister, George Grenville. Grenville complained that the American colonists, who had gained most from the recent British victory in the French and Indian War, were contributing almost nothing to the sorely depleted British treasury. To raise revenue, he insisted on collecting duties from Americans on the molasses they bought from the French. When New Englanders complained that the sixpence duty on molasses would destroy their rum industry, Grenville agreed to cut the duty in half, making it only slightly higher than the bribes the colonists were already paying. At Grenville's urging, Parliament passed the Sugar Act in 1764, which lowered the duty set by the Molasses Act but tightened enforcement. The British sent custom agents to American ports to enforce the new law. Suspected smugglers were taken to Nova Scotia and tried in British admiralty courts with no juries rather than in colonial courts where fellow colonial jurors were likely to find them innocent. Colonists from Britain to Charleston were alarmed by the unexpected turn of events. They claimed the rights of Englishmen, and since all Englishmen had the right to trial by jury, it was deeply distressed the colonists to see custom offenders hauled off to be judged by distant military tribunals. Even more alarming was the notion that Parliament had the right to tax colonial trade as a means of raising revenue. Up to this time, the British had used tariffs to direct the flow of trade to the mother country, not to add gold directly to its treasury. Could the British Parliament tax American commerce simply to raise money? The Sugar Act indicated that yes, Parliament could do just that. While many colonists objected to the Sugar Act on economic grounds, James Otis, a member of the Massachusetts General Assembly, objected to it as a matter of English liberty. The colonists, Otis explained, had no representatives in Parliament. The representatives were in their colonial legislatures, and only their own representatives had taxed them in the past. The very act of taxing, he said, exercised over those who are not represented, appears to me to be depriving them of one of their most essential rights. Taxation without representation is tyranny. The Massachusetts Assembly asked Otis to chair a committee to correspond with other colonies on Parliament's new initiatives. Otis found himself very busy. Even before the Sugar Act went into effect, Prime Minister Grenville was planning to impose more direct taxes on the American colonies. And we'll stop there for this recording and start up with the next one.